Hello again, back with the book of Romans and just doing our study with that. And I was thinking before I launch into Romans chapter 7, which is where we are going forward, that I would kind of look at my philosophy of addiction and how it relates to chapter 6 and 7, because that's kind of something that I wanted to emphasize. And my philosophy of addiction treatment is not the same as the usual models that you hear. The secular approach to things with addiction is not the approach that I have to it. Pretty much typically it views addiction as a biochemical situation, and if we change body chemistry and brain chemistry, we change cravings or we change addiction. And there's a battle that goes on theory of what came first, the chicken or the egg. Did our brains start out that way and have to be changed, or did the drug change my brains and its chemistry and its neurophysiology and all the rest of that? But what I want to do is look at this from a biblical perspective and say to you that addiction is just a word that has been altered from what scriptures call addiction. Addiction is in the Word of God, and it's in Romans chapter 6. Addiction is just a state of being where something is controlling me. It has enslaved me. Didn't Romans 6 in our study of that describe that very thing? In Romans 6:16 it says, "Do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death or of obedience resulting in righteousness? Don't you know that when you present yourself to someone as slaves for obedience?" That's describing addiction. It's describing someone whose life is completely obsessed and controlled by a chemical, by a drug, or by something else. It doesn't have to be a drug. It can be money. It can be sex. It can be food. It can be gambling. It can be 101 different things. But if it's controlling my life, then I am enslaved to it, and it is what is being referred to in Romans chapter 6. Now, in chapter 6, verse 17, he says, "But thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to which you were committed." And then if you jump ahead several more verses to verse 20, it says, "For when you were slaves of sin," slaves of a chemical, a drug, whatever, "you were free in regard to righteousness." We have changed the word from enslavement to addiction and think that we've developed this whole new approach to dealing with addiction in people's lives, when Paul spelled it out in Romans chapter 6. He described accurately what addiction is. It's simply being controlled by something other than Jesus in my heart and in my life. That is addiction. So I look at the problem as being a spiritual one, not a biochemical one. And I believe that when you approach it that way, you have a much higher success rate. Secular drug and alcohol counseling has got, a 5 to 10% success rate? Faith-based addiction treatment programs have between 67 and 85% success rate, depending on who is quoting their success rate to you. But the idea is that the success rate with a faith-based program is infinitely more successful and better than a secular approach. Why? Because if you don't diagnose the problem correctly, then the treatment that you give for the problem or the disease or whatever is not going to resolve it. If you come into a doctor's office and I come in there with cancer, and he treats me for a headache, I'm not going to get well. I'm going to probably eventually die if I don't get the correct treatment. What is the problem? Is there something wrong with aspirin? No, aspirin's great if you diagnose the problem correctly. Aspirin is great for a headache. Aspirin is great when you have a fever. But if I have cancer, that's not the correct treatment, and I'm getting the wrong treatment because my diagnosis is wrong. When you diagnose addiction incorrectly and then you apply a treatment to it that doesn't work, you get the terrible results that you get. And the fact that if you diagnose addiction as a spiritual issue, not a chemistry issue, and you get tremendously successful results from it, all that does is underline the fact that your diagnosis is correct. This is a spiritual issue. It is an issue of the heart. It's not an issue of brain chemistry. You say, well, what we have proven, though, that it does that. Well, okay, and you have treated it, and let me see the success that you have had as a result of it. Not nearly as good as when you approach this as a heart issue. In Mark chapter 7, verse 21, Jesus said, for from within a man comes adulteries, fornications, thefts, all the rest of the issues that we try to deal with through medication rather than addressing the heart. You say, well, okay, then isn't